Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. Welcome back for another week of fun and excitement in Oklahoma government and politics. I am coming to you today not from the Democracy Den, but from my home with my daughter. We are entering the second week of foul weather this month. And if you're like me, gosh, it feels like we get 3 days of bad weather followed by 3 days of illness or vice versa. And it is really hard to go to the office or get work done. Um, a big shout out to all the other parents of little ones out there who are struggling to get through the month. Don't worry. Spring is coming. It just can't get here fast enough. Speaking of which, this week, if you're listening to this, perhaps at home, because we are trapped inside again with another blast of icy weather, stay warm. Bring your pets in. The wind chill is going to be nasty. And I guess I just, apologize for getting this episode out late last week because of the weather and various illnesses and all that really went a little bit sideways for me, and it probably did for you as well. So, big high five and a tight hug to each of us as we struggle through another week. The current reality. And also, like, apologies for the bad sound quality. I'm using my AirPods rather than my, studio setup. I didn't think ahead to bring home a mixer and microphone last week, and I'm not going to go get it today. Um, Last week was really important, and in some ways, I'm glad that I waited until this weekend to record because some stuff happened on Friday that is really important. And so we'll talk about that first. Well, no, we'll talk about that second. First, we're going to talk about what happened last Tuesday, which was local elections, right? Across the state, there was like 30 something counties that had elections somewhere in each county, not county-wide necessarily. And, the obvious caveats that, like, we have a ton of elections in Oklahoma. Um, it is hard to keep up sometimes. Like, I really, really strongly encourage you to sign up for reminders, either from the election board themselves, or if you go to our website, letsfixthis.org, you can sign up with TurboVote. They'll send you a text and or an email, whatever you select. They do not sell your data. I don't get your data. But it's super handy. I've been using them for years and years, long before we ever like signed up with their tools. Just as a voter, I've started using them, and it's really helpful. And even though I do this for my job and I pay close attention, it is not uncommon for me to get a text reminder about an upcoming election that I had forgotten about. If it's like one race or a runoff for one race. So really useful. I think the state election board still offers some sort of reminder messages as well. So you can sign up there. Either one's great. Um, but it was an important election for a lot of cities in particular. This was primarily like a municipal election, but places like Bethany, Edmond, Norman all have new mayors, and in some cases, almost entirely new city councils, or at least like a new composition, right? We don't really talk about like partisan power in municipal elections because they're nonpartisan races, and honestly, like trash and water service is a nonpartisan issue. But in places like Norman, where several years ago there was kind of an effort mounted from some overtly conservative right-leaning groups to take over city council. They, won the mayor's race and they won several of the city council seats. This election last week, those seats all reverted back to a more centrist, an independent, or maybe even in some cases a progressive candidate. Which I think when you look at the composition of Norman, it's a pretty purple town, maybe blue-ish. I mean, it's got a college there, and we typically think of college towns as being more progressive leaning. Um, but Stephen Tyler Holmes, who is the newly elected mayor, is a young independent fella. Like this is I in my not as a Normanite myself, but talking to my friends there, they were all very relieved at this shift towards younger leadership and new leadership that wasn't part of some kind of like entrenched power political establishment. But that's, I think, exciting for a city like Norman. And what's interesting is the same thing happened in Bethany, right? Amanda Sandoval has been on the city council out there. She won the mayor's race. She's a young Latina, I think the first Latina to serve as mayor of Bethany. And from just some of my conversations with her, She has some really exciting ideas for the future of Bethany. Um, Bethany, if you've never even been out there in the northwest part of town, is almost entirely surrounded by Oklahoma City. It's technically surrounded by War Acres to the right, but Bethany's right about 5 square miles, maybe almost six. It's still a pretty small town, but with a really unique history. It was founded, right around just before statehood. Um, Back then, the Nazarene College, they're still there, Southern Nazarene University, which is my alma mater for my first 2 degrees. But it was founded there under a different name years ago. There's actually two colleges at Bethany. Um, and it's got a little tiny school district that's not even as big as the town, a really cute downtown with, I think, a lot of potential for economic development. It is a very changing town, and I think the way Bethany goes might be emblematic of how we're going to see Oklahoma City more broadly in the state as well. Bethany is pretty ethnically, racially diverse. It's got a growing Latino and Black population. It's, I think, getting close to being fairly evenly split between Latinos, Blacks, and white populations. There's obviously some other folks in there too. I think there's a decent Muslim community there. I think it's a pretty an, unexpectedly diverse little part of town. Um, lots of interesting tidbits about Bethany, and not just because I lived there for a while, but Amanda's election there, I think, is really important in like this narrative of the future of Bethany, and I would argue for the future of Oklahoma statewide. Edmond has a new mayor too, and that's because the previous mayor did not run for re-election. I haven't followed up to read much about the new mayor. I apologize to those Edmondites who listen to the show. If you haven't yet, I would go to NonDoc first. They had some really great profiles on all of these candidates, and that's a great place to start. Now, elections aside, well, no, wait. Before we move on, there was also a Democratic primary race for Oklahoma County Commissioner District 1, formerly held by Terry Bloomert. The winner of that race was Jason Lowe, State House member Jason Lowe. So if he hasn't already, he has to resign from the State House, which means his seat, HD 97, will be up for election. I've seen at least one person already announce that they are running for that race. I don't believe that date has been set yet for that race, but this is the trickle-down effect of electoral outcomes, right? If someone in office runs for a different office, that means the first one comes open and someone else gets to run. And I think what we see here is we're getting new blood into a lot of seats, which tells me that maybe people are ready for change. Now, there's been an anti-incumbent bias in elections for the last several cycles, including at the federal level. Well, at least for the presidential race, not for Congress. Those seats are remarkably safe. Incumbents in Congress win like 97% of the time, which is suspicious considering Congress historically has a very, very low approval rating. Anyway, I digress. Congrats to former Representative, now Commissioner Lowe, on that. Um, excuse me, he's not actually won yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. He won the primary. It was a three-way primary. And so, because it's a special election, the winner didn't have to have a majority. They had to just have a plurality. So he got less than 50% of the vote, but more than either of the two other candidates. He got 47 or something. So he wins the primary. Now there's a general election on April 1st for that same race because there is an independent in the race. So if you didn't get to vote in the primary because you were a Republican or a Libertarian, or you just chose not to vote, you have another shot. Everybody, all voters in District 1, which is kind of the central part of Oklahoma County, will get to vote on April 1st. And April 1st, again, there'll be a bunch of other elections, a bunch of municipal races, a bunch of school board races. Um, we'll see what happens then. Like I said, uh, opportunities to participate in the future of our state all the time. Not quite every month, but gosh darn, like almost every month. And if that feels like a hassle to you, man, I get it. Um, Initially, my daughter was scheduled to have surgery on election day, and so my wife and I were starting to figure out when we could vote early, because we had already missed the deadline to request absentee ballots. But the surgery got rescheduled. We were able to go vote on election day and see my friendly neighborhood poll workers, which was fun. And now I'm starting to think ahead to April 1st to make sure that I block out some time for that. And that is a burden, right? Like there are some bills this year in the legislature to consolidate elections, which this is Andy speaking. This is not necessarily on the position of any organization that I work with, but I think some consolidation would make sense, right? Like last year, I think I voted 8 times or something. There's like 8 opportunities to vote. That's too many. Most people don't pay close enough attention, and that invariably means very low turnout for a lot of these races. Now, the flip side is that the bills to consolidate elections typically focus on moving municipal and school board elections that are nonpartisan and putting them on the ballot with other partisan elections. And because partisanship can um, kind of bias people towards turning out more regularly. So if they're turning out because of, let's say, the presidential race, it ends up with a different audience that turns out. And while I generally want everybody to vote, the reality is like people turn out because of what they're excited about. And if that happens to be a really partisan race, then you get really partisan voters casting ballots in a race that is nonpartisan. And that can skew the outcomes in ways that I don't think the majority of people want. So, my suggestion for anyone who's listening is that we have 4 elections a year. That's it. Like 2 in the spring, 2 in the fall. And it's essentially a primary and a general, and then a primary and a general. The first 2 are nonpartisan, so city and school board. And then the last 2 are partisan. So maybe we do, I don't know, February, April, June, November. That feels like a long time. Now, the problem with my plan is that it doesn't include runoffs, right? And in some cases, we don't have them if it's a special election. But runoffs are an added expense that we don't need because what we could do is to use instant runoff voting, or some people call it ranked choice voting, same difference basically, right? Where you have one election and you just rank the candidates in order of your preference. So you're like, I like this person first, this person second, this person third, if you want, however many there are. And then that's it. You cast your ballot and you're done. And then when they tabulate it, like if someone wins outright, then they win outright. And if not, then the lowest person kind of gets eliminated, and they just they redistribute those votes to the second preference. So it's an excellent way to do it. It sounds newfangled in America, but golly, other countries have been doing it for years. Australia's been doing it for years. Ireland's been doing it for years. Israel, I think, does it. Like it's everywhere. And it's not new. It is not even that novel. It's just a really good and efficient way to run elections. Um, anyway, we can come back to that. I'm getting off topic here. All right. Well, the other thing, we talked about the trickle down impact of electoral outcomes, but let's talk about the trickle down economics. And arguably, what I fear, I'm not an economist, I play one on the radio, but I think what we're getting closer and closer to is going to be some sort of trickle down economic collapse. Um, and that is worrisome. And I know many of us are already anxious about the state of the world today, or state of America today, and this is not really going to help. However, I'm probably not telling you anything that's too new that you haven't already heard. We'll just frame it in a different way to connect the dots in a way that I hope is helpful. Friday, the State Board of Equalization met. As you may recall, the State Board of Equalization is a committee, the governor, lieutenant governor, the state treasurer, the state auditor, a few other people, the AG, a bunch of other people are on that committee, and they vote to review numbers, right? Tax revenue, how much money is coming in, how much money do we expect to come in for the rest of this fiscal year and for next fiscal year, right? Which starts July 1st. And that's important because this Board of Equalization meeting gets those final numbers to say, here's what we project the numbers will be for next fiscal year. And that's the number that the legislature has to build the budget around. Now, I have said many of times before, I am consistently and annually frustrated that we budget on a 1 year basis and we don't think ahead. I know that there's laws that we can't encumber future legislatures. unbudget stuff, but gosh darn it, like plan out 5 years, 10 years, right? We've done it for roads and bridges. We should do it for everything else about where do we want to be in 10 years? When we're just operating on a 1 year basis, we almost never achieve these goals. Governor Stitt has been talking for 6 years about being a top 10 state. I still don't know top 10 in what. He said it's aspirational, but he hasn't laid out like a plan to get there for anything, right? I'll tell you what, if I was running for governor, even if I used the same kind of top 10 nomenclature, I would come out with some plans, right? I'd be like Elizabeth Warrening this with some big plans for like how we're going to get there on certain things over the next 10 years, knowing that I wouldn't even be in office to see those things happen. But I think we can make some long-term plans as a state. Okay, I'm going to get off that soapbox. The Board of Equalization met and certified the numbers, saying that the state will have about $12.3 billion to budget out for next year. No, excuse me, $12.4 billion for fiscal year 2026. Um, the challenge with that is that that is a bit lower than what we had this past year. We had about 12.5 billion for the current fiscal year. So we're looking at one to I guess about 100 million less. I think it's 119 million less than this year. And it also showed, the meeting showed that future revenues are expected to decline. So we think we're going to have 12.4 billion, but if income revenue keeps decreasing, it might end up being less. And if you think back a few years, we've had this happen before. Of that money, there's about, I think, 12.3 billion that might be like recurring revenue or something. Maybe it's more than that. Anyway, I think it's like 11 billion so recurring revenue, and then about 1 or 1.5 billion in one-time money. Now, I don't know why we would be budgeting um, long-term programs based on 1 year money. We shouldn't do that, right? Like the sustaining of the state should be based on that recurring revenue, and then one-time money should be used for one-time expenses, right? So maybe that's like building specific bridges, maybe that's repairing specific roads, but it's like dedicated to a certain thing. That is generally not hiring staff long-term. It is generally not, trying to build a program that's supposed to last 5 years when you've got one-time money. We can't count on that. The other fly in the ointment here is that the state has about 4.6 billion in reserves, in various savings accounts, rainy day funds, which we will need when the economy tanks someday, and it will. The ebb and flow of the economy is a thing. In fact, when Stitt took office, it was almost no money in there, and so to build it back up is a big deal. Do we have too much in there? Well, that's hard to say, right? Um, it's hard to know how much you need until you're faced with it. But man, if we had another pandemic or there's a war and the price of oil fell out or oil and gas fell out, and suddenly we have dramatically less money coming in, we would need those reserves to help fill in so we don't just have a mass layoff of tens of thousands of state employees and the massive like cutting of state services. But Governor Stitt also wants pretty substantial tax cuts, right? He wants a to reduce both the income, the this personal and the corporate income tax rates by 0.5%, I think. Um, that cut to this personal income tax, what you and I pay, he's been talking about it costing $240 million. Well, that's just for the first half a year, right? It's actually going to cost 600 million per year. So over 10 years, that's $6 billion, just to be clear, right? If he cuts this, and it's so hard for them to raise taxes, so a cut is essentially permanent. And the governor is proposing cutting $6 billion out of our state economy for the next 10 years. Now, his quotes, and I'm reading from an Oklahoma Voice article, he says, quote, "It's not like I'm cutting 240 million. I'm just leaving it in their pockets, right? So it gets spent at the grocery store, it gets spent at the gas station, it gets spent at the bicycle shop." And he's also not advocating to use state reserves to pay for it. Now, what he says is two things are wrong here. One, it's not like I'm cutting 240 million. No, you're cutting 600 million, just to be clear. Like you're using the smaller number to make it seem like it's not that big of a deal, but 600 million is a BFD. It's a big fucking deal. And just because you leave the money in people's pockets, okay, that's true, but you are cutting that money from the state budget, right? And most of us are going to save like $30 to $75 a year, right? You might not even save $10 a month. It's like you are not going to feel this as like a major impact. Who will feel it are the really wealthy people who will save thousands of dollars, right? Because their income is a lot higher. And so most of Oklahomans won't actually save any money. The rich people will save a lot of money, and they will save it at the expense of all of the state services. So you might get an extra 50 or $60 to save at the grocery store per year. That's not, that's going to like, not even, that's going to be absorbed by the cost of eggs, right? Like, you're not going to feel it, but it is going to mean that we'd have $600 million per year less to spend on schools, on National Guard, on roads and bridges, on uh, highway patrol. I don't know, like corrections, um, adoption programs, rural healthcare, Medicaid, like anything the state funds. And again, like nobody likes paying taxes. Like we all love to hate taxes, except like I pay $50 a year, and ideally that means an extra $50 a year. That means that like our highways aren't crumbling. Which, if you've driven around a lot lately, they kind of are. I'll pay an extra 50, $3 a month or something. Like that's a big deal. So anyway, I'm just saying the way he framed this is wrong, right? He is cutting more than 240 million. He's proposing 600 million a year. And just because you keep a little bit of money in your pocket doesn't mean that everything's the same. It means that the state has 600 million per year less. 6 billion over a decade. Arguably more than that when you account for inflation, right? Why would we? This is like cutting off your nose to spite your face. He's not even running for re-election. Like this is a bad idea. Now his plan here, right? This is classic Reaganomics, right? Trickle down economics. Well, if we cut taxes for everybody, yeah, the wealthy benefit more, but they will reinvest that money in the economy, and that extra wealth will trickle down to all of us at the bottom, right? We'll be glad that the rich man gave us a little bit of wine in our glass. No, that's not how it works. When, Reagan's been, this was the case when I was a kid, and look at us now. People can't afford to buy houses. People are going bankrupt because of medical bills. Like our schools are hemorrhaging teachers. We have a record number uh, of alternatively certified teachers. We have thousands of spots that are open. We're 48th, 49th in education. Like this plan they've tried for 40 years and it is not working. But here we go again. Wants to try it again. So we, um, so this trickle down part is bad. Just the tax cut plan is bad. Now the tax cut plan might not pass, right? The legislature's got to be the ones to pass it anyway. But also recently, right, since President Trump anointed Elon Musk and his Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, right? I'm sure you've seen the news stories about it, right? Today we woke up to news that they are going to fire like 10,000 IRS employees, um, which is a federal problem that we can talk about later. But at the state level, right, after Trump did it, then all these governors, including Governor Stitt, said, hey, we're going to do that too. So Governor Stitt, who's been in office for 6 years as a businessman and hasn't had this idea himself, is hiring someone to be the DOGE-OK person, right? He announced this in his State of the State address a couple of weeks ago. He has appointed a man named Mark Nuttall, that's Mark with a C, who will serve as a, quote, unpaid special volunteer. So this is not an appointment, right? That doesn't have to be confirmed by the state senate, much like Elon Musk at the federal level. It's a government official going outside the system to bring somebody in and giving them access and power to make changes in our state. This is not someone we elected, and not even someone that's been appointed and vetted and like approved by the legislature. So I have some concerns of that. Nuttall said in his statement, My mission is simple: to ensure every tax dollar is spent strategically with purpose and accountability. Time is of the essence. So apparently, he wants to be really quick at this. Um, and this is, I think, we should be very concerned, right? So he's supposed to have a report no later than March 31st. And I guess to be clear, it doesn't sound like from this so far that Nuttall will have any power to make decisions. He'll just be like doing research. But it does say that Nuttall will have immediate access to agency records, software, and IT systems as part of an executive order issued by Stitt forming this new division. So it sounds like someone who's going to have access to a lot of our personal information that none of us elected, and we don't. It's something that just happened, and you're just going to turn over the keys to somebody. So a quick Google of Mark Nuttall. You can go to marknuttall.com. It's his website because I didn't know who he was. About Mark Nuttall, I'm just reading from his website. Mark Nuttall is the only person who has been involved in a federal campaign in all 50 states. I was like, right there. Why? Well, that's your first point of qualifications for what? Anyway, next bullet point: manage the campaign for president of the United States, run the National Republican Congressional Committee, managed the nationwide political affairs of a national small business association, and advised 3 U.S. presidents and a number of foreign governments around the world. Then he's got like a longer bio here, right? So it's an attorney based in Norman who specializes in international trade, international foreign policy, and international political affairs, which totally makes sense. Then he would be working at one small state here in the middle of this domestic union. Um, he is the author of, I guess this is all one thing. I don't know if it's a book, but it's called Moment of Truth: How Our Government's Addiction to Spending and Power Will Destroy Everything That Makes America Great. I've not read it, but I'm definitely going to go Google it based on that name. Also, is it just me? Every time someone uses like "makes America great" something, and the Republican, it just seems like pandering to President Trump. The Democrats are not as disciplined with message, but it's like so transparently obvious with the Republicans that it's real funny to me. Anyway, you read down through his bio. He's advised countries like Bulgaria, Ukraine, Russia, and Guatemala, as well as corporations owned and controlled by the People's Republic of China. So he's advising Chinese corporations, Russia, cool, cool. Um, he's spoken with conservative party leaders in England. He advised the Republican Institute in Sudan. Okay, cool. Served as legal counsel of President Reagan's U.S. Synthetic Fuels Transition Team. He's a member of Brad Henry's steering committee. Um, no, Governor Henry was a Democrat, so that's interesting. In the past several decades, he's represented legal counsel and political counsel, numerous state House rep campaigns, Senate campaigns, gubernatorial campaigns, state House, state Senate campaigns, all states in the continental U.S., so not Alaska and Hawaii. He served on Senator Dewey Bartlett's staff, Governor Henry Bellman's senatorial campaign staff, served as a counselor to Senator Don Nichols, advisor to Senator Jim Inhofe, field counsel for the 1984 Reagan-Bush reelect campaign. He was a campaign manager for Pat Robertson's presidential campaign in 1988. That's the one he's referencing earlier. Advisor to Bush. Okay, so he's been around politics, particularly Republican politics, for a long, long time. He was involved in the Bush-Gore recount effort in 2000, right, with the dangling chads. At the end of people's bios, they like say, like, here's all the places I've been featured in the news. So it's like every news outlet, basically, including Governor Mike Huckabee's program. Doesn't even have the name of it, just Governor Mike Huckabee's program. Blah, 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 Flashpoint, The Verdict, and many other regional shows. Then it concludes with, in 1998, he served as a judge for the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Isn't Miss America pageant the one that Trump bought? Or did he buy Miss USA? Does it matter? What a weird thing to put in your personal or your professional bio. All right, so Mark Nuttall, career politician or politician adjacent, right? Maybe worse than a politician. He's like a campaign consultant who's like made his money advising people on these economic policies, undoubtedly about trickle down economics, right? So now we've got here in the state, right, the governor calling for massive tax cuts that would arguably cripple the state budget for the next decade, right? It will result in across the board funding cuts to almost every agency. You've got this guy undoubtedly going to recommend pretty substantial cuts to the state budget through in cutting state agencies. So if you're a state employee, I'd be real nervous. And and DOGE at the federal level, right? Last week, on February 7th, had massive cuts to the National Institute for Health, NIH, and those cuts are like resounding through the economy already, right? Just the news that this is going to be happening is a huge deal. So they said they're going to the cuts to NIH are twofold. One, just like there's some budget cuts. Secondly, they're going to reduce grants. There's a provision in like most federal grants that say the indirect costs have to be limited to a certain percentage. I think it's been 25%, but this new policy is it's only going to be 15%. Now, indirect costs is a catch-all for a lot of stuff. Like when I used to work in a federally funded program for HIV services, our indirect costs for our medical clinic included the front desk staff. It included computers, software, including the electronic medical record system, which is really expensive, right? Any kind of administrative oversight, quality control, anything that like wasn't a direct provision of services. Now, I don't know how much you know about healthcare. It's a pain in lots of ways, but like you have to fund more than just the doctors and nurses themselves, right? You have to fund the back office staff that does the billing, that answers the phones, that does the payroll, like all the administrative aspects, like that tends to be captured in the indirect cost. At a university level, especially for research grants, the indirect costs help cover like rent for the facilities, like office space, like lights, desks, chairs, equipment, a lot of that stuff that is not this salary of the researcher or research staff directly. And so there's like 2,500 universities in the US that receive NIH funding, and now they're all panicked. Here in Oklahoma, I'll cut to the chase here. In Oklahoma, our two largest universities, OU and OSU, would see massive cuts. Um, for this year, OU receives over $73 million of its budget from NIH. 60 million of that goes to the OU Health Sciences Center. And then at OSU, they get about 24.5 million from NIH funding. So together, this is like $100 million that goes specifically into like funding science and healthcare in Oklahoma that would go away. And I had lunch with a scientist last week who works at a federally funded research facility here, and they said that like this will result in massive staff cuts and it'll set science back like 10 years, right? Like all these research projects, like, I don't know, cures for cancer and autoimmune diseases and all this kind of research that's happening, Medicare pharmaceutical research will necessarily have to stop. And that means that like you can't just like stop it today and then pick it up again in 5 years if we have a new president with new policies, right? Like that funding stream dries up, that science dries up, and people like we lose the momentum we've been building for 200 years around scientific advancement in America. And if Oklahoma is hoping to lead the world in the development of this stuff, we should not take our foot off the gas pedal, right? The world has COVID vaccines and saved billions of lives because of Operation Warp Speed, which was a project of President Trump in his first term, right? Like, why would we do this now? So these to kind of come back around to this like trickle down idea of like what I've said, trickle down economic collapse. You've got the federal government cutting federal funding. And Oklahoma gets a lot of federal funding, not just NIH, but otherwise, right? So here in Oklahoma, we are going to feel the impact of these federal cuts in a very personal way. And the first of my friends last week lost their jobs. They don't work in research; they work in like child welfare. A social worker was the first person that I know in the federal government that lost their job. I have other friends that work in like child nutrition that are very nervous. Friends that work in agriculture, like forestry, and like ensuring we take good care of our like water rights and vegetation. They're nervous, right? People who work at the National Weather Service. Holy moly. Does Oklahoma need that? Yes. Like this week is a good example of like watching what the scientists are telling us about what's happening in weather. And not it's not just the people at the National Weather Service. Like the TV people rely on them too, right? You know who runs all of these weather models? The government in the US, in Europe. Like these are the kinds of things that benefit everybody, right? We all pay in a tiny bit of money through taxes, and it helps fund massive science projects that can, I don't know, put a goddamn man on the moon or predict when the weather's going to change or ensure that grandma has health care or that kids in rural areas don't starve. This is what government's good at, solving big problems because we pool our money and we trust smart people to do it. If you start cutting the people and the money, we don't get the outcomes. So if the federal government starts cutting, not starts, or not if, they are cutting. So we're going to see the direct provision of services in Oklahoma hindered by those federal cuts. We're going to see workforce losses, thousands of people going unemployed in Oklahoma or thrust into unemployment unexpectedly. Then you're going to have science drying up, which means we're not attracting those businesses either, right? Like even private healthcare companies, pharmaceutical companies aren't going to want to relocate to a city or a state where they don't have any research facilities that are funded. So that stuff dries up. Then the governor wants to, strip $600 million a year from our state budgets. And he's hired some outsider who believes all this trickle down mess. And he's going to have him come in and tell us what else we should cut. And how much do you want to bet that whatever Mr. Nuttall comes up with for like savings, quote savings, is going to be cutting government programs, cutting state programs to about the tune of 600 million a year, right? I would not at all be surprised if on March 31st we get a report from this DOGE-OK department that says we should cut something that's going to come out to around 600 million, give or take. Anything from 500 to 700 is my guess. But I bet he will come up with a way to save, quote, save money to pay for these tax cuts so that it's like a revenue neutral thing. All right, that's a little doom and gloom. I know I spoke too fast and it was real sad and angry at points. I'm just telling you, friends. There's not it. Well, I'm just telling you to keep your eyes open, right, and to be looking for what happens in the next few years. To some extent, brace for impact, right? We should be aware that things are going to get a bit tighter, a bit more painful, at least for the next year, maybe two, right? But that does not mean that we are powerless. And hear me when I say this. If you are feeling depressed or anxious after that last like 40 minutes of me ranting about trickle down economic collapse, know that you are not powerless. We are not powerless, especially at the state level. We'll talk about Washington in a second because Washington is far away and feels insurmountable. But here in Oklahoma, our governor does not have as much power as he thinks he does. He has already tried to get more power. They gave it to him some and they took it back. And we're starting to see in the news, right, when you read these news stories about what this governor wants, look for the comments from the legislature. Look for the A and B chairs, what they say. Look what the speaker and the pro tem say. Talk to your elected officials because you will see that they are nervous, just like I am, just like you are, right? The governor's going to be out of office in 2 years, but a lot of these legislators aren't. Like, they want to run for re-election in 2 years, and they are terrified they're going to have to run for re-election in an environment where our state's economy has collapsed or is on the brink of collapse, right? Many of them want good schools. They want the same things you and I want. They are scared about it because they see their position of power as being based in allegiance with the governor, and that is not necessarily the case. The governor does not elect them. You do, right? When it comes to the ballot box, the governor gets one vote. Now, he can use his bully pulpit, he can make endorsements, but at the end of the day, it is the people in their districts who vote. And so if you are nervous about this, talk to or follow organizations who deal with this stuff. OK Policy is a great place to start when it comes to the budget, for sure, right? Like just general budget and tax policy, they're the best go-to. If it's some other issue, if it's a healthcare research, something, like, look around for organizations or contact us and I can help point you in the right way for organizations who advocate on these issues. And I, by following them, you can help like stay in the loop on what legislation is pending. But you can send letters, emails, make phone calls to your legislators for sure, your state rep, your state senator, but also everybody else. Call the chair of A and B, right? In the House, in the Senate, call them and say, hey, like, I know you're not my representative or not my senator, but I know you're chair of this, and I'm so excited you're in that position. Like, here's my concern, right? Like, I want you to do a good job. And this is what we need. Here's what's happening in my world. I live in a town and we have a small hospital and it has saved lives here. And if we roll out these cuts, it is going to close the hospital and we're going to die. And that sounds egregious and like exaggerative. I don't even know if that's a word, but like it sounds, dramatic. And maybe it is, except we've seen it happen. Like we've seen rural hospitals close and women in labor have to drive hours to deliver a baby in a hospital. It's not, it's the year 2025. It's not 1825. You don't have to deliver at home. You should deliver in a fully functional healthcare facility where they can respond if shit goes sideways. Like, you should call your legislators politely, respectfully, and tell them, like, how are you feeling about things? And you don't have to have every data point nailed down. If you do, that's great. That's helpful. But like calling them with a message from your heart and saying, listen, I see what's happened at the federal level, and I get where he's coming from, that we all want to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. We want a more efficient government. None of us is arguing that the government is super efficient. But if the feds are going to start cutting jobs and funding, what's going to happen to the state? At the very least, we're going to pick up the slack, right? We can't, or we're going to absorb the cuts and then add more to it. No, this trickle down of cuts, the jobs, the services, is going to impact all of us, right? That's the message that resonates, I think, at least with me. They talk about, trickle down tax cuts. No, what's happening is trickle down job cuts, trickle down service cuts. That's what's happening. So I worry about us in Oklahoma, a small state, only 4 million people. Right? We're 1/10 the size of California. Our economy is overly reliant on just a couple of industries. And we've seen time and time and time again in our history this ebb and flow, boom and bust cycle of our state's economy. And it is exhausting and in some cases deadly. And it's certainly demoralizing, right? Anyone who's lived here for 10 years remembers what it was like in 2014, 2015. Oil and gas was on a tear. It felt like money was flowing. Everybody knew someone who worked at Chesapeake and drove a nice car. Everyone got free t-shirts at the Thunder games. It felt like a different world. They were building big buildings. There were skyscrapers going up. Oklahoma City was booming, right? Same thing's happening in Tulsa. And then what happened? Just like a year or two later, yeah, some of that was some funny record keeping, but as that wave died, right, and that money dried up, we didn't really see a full on recession, but this slowdown was not just economic, it was emotional. And we went through a pandemic, and now we're all stuck at home with freezing weather, feeling disconnected from our friends, from our family, from what's happening in the world. You might feel powerless. You're not. You're not powerless. So this week, while you're stuck at home in the yet another round of ice and snow, undoubtedly fueled by climate change, send some emails, make some phone calls. Use that as an opportunity to make a difference in your world. Why? Because decisions are made by those who show up. Stay warm this week. Talk to you next week.